Elias stood frozen in the dim light of his cellar, holding a rusted dog tag that should not have been there. Beside him, Barnaby was growling at a hidden stone wall, his eyes fixed on a darkness that felt alive. What was the Titan Corporation trying to bury beneath this peaceful Montana ranch? And how could an old scout and a weary dog hope to survive a secret that had already silenced others forever? Will the truth finally flow clear, or will the shadows of Silver Ridge swallow them whole? Join our journey of courage and loyalty by subscribing to the channel now to see how this mystery unfolds. Chapter 1. Echoes of the Scars. The mountain air of Montana was thin and sharp. It carried the scent of pine needles and damp earth. Elias stood on the porch of the Silver Ridge Ranch. He gripped the wooden railing until his knuckles turned white. Below him, the valley stretched out like a sea of faded gold. It was quiet. This was the silence he had paid for with 20 years of his life. Behind him, the screen door creaked on its rusted hinges. Barnaby stepped out. The old bloodhound moved with a slow and deliberate dignity. His long ears brushed against the floorboards. His liver-colored fur was dusty from the road. Barnaby let out a heavy sigh and settled at Elias's feet. The weight of the dog against his boot was the only thing keeping Elias from floating away into his own mind. Elias was a retired Marine scout. His body was a map of scars. Some were visible on his skin. Others were buried deep where no light could reach them. He had come to this abandoned ranch to disappear. He wanted to forget the heat of the desert. He wanted to drown out the memory of static on a radio. The farmhouse was a skeleton of a home. It had been empty for a long time. The windows were clouded with grime. The air inside smelled of stale cedar and old shadows. Every step Elias took caused the floorboards to groan. It sounded like a house that was tired of holding itself up. Clouds began to gather over the jagged peaks of the mountains. They were heavy and dark. They looked like bruises on the sky. Elias watched them with a growing sense of dread. He knew what was coming. He could feel the change in the air pressure in the marrow of his bones. A distant rumble rolled across the valley. It was low and rhythmic. To a normal person, it was just the sound of a summer storm. But to Elias, it was the sound of heavy artillery. His breathing hitched. His heart began to hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. The porch began to fade. The smell of pine vanished. Suddenly he was back in the sand. He could smell burnt rubber. He could hear the chaotic shouting of men over the roar of engines. Another roll of thunder echoed through the hills. This time it was louder. It sounded like a massive explosion near the perimeter. Elias felt his knees buckle. He reached for his holster, but there was nothing there. He was unarmed. He was vulnerable. He was lost in a ghost world. Then he felt it, a firm and steady pressure against his thigh. Barnaby had stood up. The dog pressed his large, heavy head against Elias's leg. He did not bark. He did not whine. He simply leaned his entire weight into his master. Barnaby's amber eyes were fixed on Elias's face. They were filled with an ancient, wordless wisdom. Elias reached down with a trembling hand. He buried his fingers in the soft, loose skin of Barnaby's neck. He focused on the warmth of the dog's body. He focused on the slow thumping of Barnaby's tail against the porch. The storm is in the sky, Elias, not in your head. He whispered the words to himself. Slowly, the desert faded away. The smell of the Montana rain returned. The pounding in his chest slowed down. He took a long, shaky breath and looked down at his companion. Barnaby gave a small lick to his hand. The dog knew the war was over, even if Elias did not. They went inside as the first heavy drops of rain began to pelt the roof. Elias needed to stay busy. He needed to work until his muscles ached. That was the only way to keep the shadows at bay. He grabbed a broom and a bucket of soapy water. He started in the main living area. The fireplace was the heart of the room. It was built from heavy river stones. It was cold and filled with gray ash. Elias knelt down to sweep the hearth. He noticed one of the bricks near the base looked different. It was slightly recessed. He reached out and gave it a tug. The stone shifted easily. It was not held in place by mortar. Elias pulled the brick free and set it on the floor. Inside the dark cavity sat a small book. It was bound in weathered leather. The edges were frayed. Elias pulled it out with careful fingers. He wiped the dust from the cover. There were no titles, just the faded scent of pipe tobacco and peppermint. He sat on the floor with his back against the stone. Barnaby circled 3 times and collapsed beside him. Elias opened the first page. The handwriting was cramped but elegant. It belonged to Silas, the previous owner of Silver Ridge. Elias began to read. He expected to find ledgers or farming logs. Instead, he found a heart. Silas had written letters to his daughter. He described the way the morning light hit the creek. He wrote about the birth of a calf in the middle of a blizzard. He spoke of the land as if it were a living person. But as Elias flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The entries became shorter. The ink seemed darker. Silas began to write about the water. He mentioned a strange metallic taste in the well. He wrote about the birds disappearing from the trees near the northern fence line. The letters spoke of men in suits, men who arrived in black trucks. They offered Silas money for a land he loved more than life itself. Silas called it a growing danger. He wrote that something was happening beneath the soil, something that was poisoning the very soul of the ridge. The last entry was unfinished. It was a plea for someone to listen. It was a warning that the beauty of Montana was being bled dry in secret. Elias closed the book. The house felt different now. It was no longer just a place to hide. It felt like a witness. He looked at the dog. Barnaby was watching him intently. The bloodhound's nose twitched as if he were catching a scent from the pages of the diary. A scent of old fear and hidden truth. Elias felt a spark in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in a very long time. It was the feeling of a mission. He was a scout. His job was to find what was hidden. His job was to protect the perimeter. The mountains outside were dark now. The rain continued to wash over the roof. Elias ran his hand over the leather cover of the diary. He looked at the empty hearth. "I hear you, Silas." He looked at Barnaby. The dog stood up and shook himself. His long ears flapped loudly against his jowls. Barnaby walked toward the door leading to the cellar. He stopped and looked back at Elias. The silence of the ranch was no longer empty. It was full of questions. Elias stood up. His joints popped, but his gaze was sharp. The shadows in the corners of the room didn't seem as frightening anymore. They were just places where the truth was waiting to be found. He had come to Montana to die in peace. But as he looked at the diary in his hand, he realized he might have to fight one more time. And this time he wasn't alone. He had the finest nose in the state, and the spirit of a man who refused to sell his soul. The storm outside raged on, but inside the kitchen, Elias turned on a single lantern. The yellow light pushed back the darkness. He sat down at the wooden table and began to study the maps tucked into the back of the diary. Tomorrow they would start. Tomorrow the scout would go back to work. Chapter 2. The Scent of Betrayal. The morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick Montana mist. Elias sat at the kitchen table with a mug of black coffee. He watched the steam rise in silence. Across the room, Barnaby was not resting in his usual spot by the stove. The old bloodhound was pacing near the hallway. His heavy paws made a rhythmic thumping sound against the linoleum floor. Barnaby stopped at the heavy oak door that led to the cellar. He began to scratch at the wood. It was a persistent and frantic sound. Elias watched him with a furrowed brow. The dog had never shown interest in the basement before. Barnaby looked back at Elias. He let out a low and urgent moan. It was the sound he made when he found a trail that could not be ignored. Elias stood up and set his coffee down. He felt a familiar prickle of alertness on the back of his neck. He opened the cellar door. The air that rushed up was cold and smelled of damp stone. Elias grabbed a heavy industrial flashlight from the counter. He followed the dog down the steep wooden stairs. In the corner of the cellar stood a row of massive wine racks. They were empty and covered in thick cobwebs. Barnaby did not stop. He squeezed his large body behind the furthest rack. He began to dig at the dirt floor with intense focus. Elias moved the rack aside. It groaned under the pressure. Behind it, the stone foundation of the house looked uneven. He pressed his hand against a large slab of granite. The rock shifted. It did not lead to a wall, but to a void. With a hard push, the slab swung inward on hidden iron hinges. A dark tunnel yawned open before them. Elias shone his light into the darkness. The beam traveled far before hitting a wooden support beam. This was not a basement. It was the entrance to a silver mine. The air inside the tunnel changed. It was no longer just damp. A sharp and bitter smell began to burn the back of Elias's throat. Barnaby put his nose to the ground. His tail was stiff. He moved forward into the darkness with a purposeful stride. They walked for several hundred yards. The tunnel was narrow and jagged. Elias noticed the tracks on the floor were not from mine carts. They were fresh boot prints. The bitter smell grew stronger. It began to smell like burnt plastic and sulfur. Barnaby stopped abruptly. He lowered his head and let out a soft rumble of warning. Elias swept his flashlight across the cavern floor. He saw a series of modern plastic pipes. They were jet black and ran along the edge of the tunnel wall. The pipes hummed with a low vibration. He followed the pipes to a large fissure in the rock. Here the pipes ended. A thick and oily green liquid was pumping steadily into a deep natural spring. The liquid hissed as it hit the clear water. Elias knelt by the spring. He saw the logo on the side of a nearby valve. It was the symbol of the Titan Corporation. This was the source of the metallic taste Silas had written about. This was the poison. The corporation was using the abandoned mine as a secret drain for their industrial waste. They were dumping death directly into the valley's heart. Barnaby drifted away from the pipes. He was sniffing a pile of loose rubble near a collapsed timber. The dog began to nudge a small object with his nose. Elias walked over and picked it up. It was heavy and cold. He wiped away the grime with his thumb. It was a rusted military dog tag. Elias held it under the flashlight. The name belonged to a young man, a private who had served in the same branch as Elias. He remembered the diary. Silas had mentioned a young assistant who helped him on the ranch. Elias felt a cold fury settle in his chest. This soldier had disappeared along with Silas. They had not left by choice. They had stumbled upon this tunnel. They had seen the pipes. The Titan Corporation had not just bought the silence of the town. They had buried the people who tried to speak. Barnaby sat back on his haunches. He looked at Elias with a mournful expression. It was as if the dog understood the weight of the metal tag in Elias's palm. The scout in Elias took over. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an empty glass jar. He carefully dipped it into the spring where the green liquid mixed with the water. He sealed the lid tight. He tucked the jar and the dog tag into his jacket pocket. These were his weapons now. Elias looked around the dark tunnel one last time. He felt the phantom weight of a rifle on his shoulder. The peace he had sought in Montana was a lie. There was no peace while a predator was stalking the land. He turned back toward the cellar entrance. Barnaby stayed close to his side. The walk back was silent, but Elias's mind was racing. He knew the corporation would have eyes everywhere. He knew the police were likely on their payroll. He was one man and one dog against a mountain of gold. As they climbed back into the kitchen, Elias locked the cellar door. He bolted it tight. He looked at Barnaby. The dog's eyes were steady and brave. Elias walked to the window. He looked out at the rolling hills of Silver Ridge. The valley looked beautiful and innocent in the morning light, but beneath that beauty, a heart was being poisoned. He reached out and stroked Barnaby's head. "The mission has changed," Elias whispered into the quiet room. His hand was no longer trembling. The fog of his past had cleared. He had spent years feeling like a ghost. But now he had a reason to be a soldier again. The Titan Corporation thought they had hidden their sins in the dark. They thought they were dealing with a broken old man and a useless dog. They were wrong. Elias sat down and began to clean his old scouting binoculars. He moved with a slow and lethal precision. The scout was back on the line, and Barnaby was ready to lead the way. The betrayal of Silver Ridge was deep, but the resolve of the man and his dog was deeper. The war had followed him to Montana, and this time he was going to win. Chapter 3. Tactics in the Shadows. The drive into town was a quiet one. Elias gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup truck. The glass jar filled with tainted water sat securely in the cup holder. It looked innocent, just a bit of murky liquid. But to Elias, it felt like a ticking bomb. Barnaby sat in the passenger seat. His large head was tilted toward the open window. He was catching the scents of the valley. He seemed to know that they were no longer just residents of Silver Ridge. They were investigators. Elias walked into the local sheriff's office. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and floor wax. A deputy sat behind a high wooden desk. He did not look up when Elias approached. "I need to report illegal hazardous waste dumping," Elias said. His voice was steady. It was the voice of a man used to giving reports under pressure. He placed the jar on the counter. He also laid out a clear photograph he had taken of the Titan Corporation logo in the mine. The deputy looked at the jar. Then he looked at Elias. There was no surprise in his eyes. There was only a cold and weary indifference. "The silver mines have been closed for decades, mister," the deputy said. He pushed the jar back toward Elias with the tip of a pen. "Probably just some old mineral runoff. It happens every time we get a heavy rain." "This isn't runoff," Elias replied. "There are modern pipes, fresh boot prints, and a corporation logo." The deputy leaned back. He gave Elias a long and suspicious glance. It was the kind of look a predator gives to something it wants to go away. "Listen, Titan is the only reason this county has a paved road. They provide jobs. They provide tax money. Maybe you should spend more time fixing up that old ranch and less time poking around in dark holes." Elias took the jar back. He didn't argue. He knew that look. He had seen it in war zones where the local police were on a warlord's payroll. He walked back to his truck. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana breeze. The Titan Corporation had not just poisoned the water. They had poisoned the people. Their wealth had bought the silence of every man in a uniform. He drove to the post office. He moved with a quiet urgency. He made 3 copies of Silas's diary. He printed the photos he had taken of the pipes and the dog tag. He addressed a heavy envelope to a man named Miller. Miller was a former Marine lawyer living in Washington, D.C. They had served together in a desert thousands of miles away. Miller was a man who believed in the law as much as Elias believed in a mission. "Keep this safe," Elias whispered as he handed the package to the clerk. "If you don't hear from me, open it." He drove back to the ranch. He didn't go inside. Instead, he went to a heavy metal trunk in the shed. He pulled out several small camouflage devices. They were motion sensor trail cameras. He had used similar tools to track enemy movements years ago. Elias and Barnaby spent the afternoon moving through the woods. They moved like ghosts. Elias climbed trees and mounted cameras in high hidden branches. He placed them near the mine entrance. He placed them along the main road leading to his gate. Barnaby stood guard. He kept his ears forward. Every snap of a dry twig made the dog freeze. By sunset, the ranch was a fortress of glass and sensors. Elias sat on the porch. He held a small handheld monitor. He watched the black and white feeds from the woods. The silence of the night felt heavy. It felt like a held breath. Around midnight, the peace was shattered. Barnaby had been sleeping near the door. Suddenly, he scrambled to his feet. A deep and frantic series of growls erupted from his throat. He ran to the window and scratched at the glass. Elias grabbed his monitor. One of the cameras near the driveway showed a flicker of movement. 2 figures in dark clothing were moving through the tall grass. They carried long, heavy objects. They were not there to talk. Elias felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. His mind went into tactical mode. He knew he could not engage them directly. That would give the corporation exactly what they wanted. A reason to call the sheriff on him. He had to be smarter. He reached for a small remote on the table. He had spent the evening setting up a few surprises. 100 yards away near the old barn, a high-powered floodlight suddenly burst into life. It bathed the intruders in a blinding white glare. The figures froze. At the same time, Elias triggered a recording on a set of speakers hidden in the trees. The sound of a heavy diesel engine starting up began to roar through the woods. The intruders panicked. They thought a patrol was coming. They turned and ran back toward the road. Their footsteps made a frantic scuffling sound against the gravel. Elias watched them disappear on his monitor. He did not feel relief. He felt the weight of the escalation. He went to the kitchen to call Miller. He picked up the receiver of the landline. There was no dial tone, only an empty, hollow silence. He checked his cell phone. No signal, not even a single bar. The line had been cut. The tower near the ridge was likely tampered with. He was isolated. Elias sat at the table in the dark. Barnaby came over and rested his heavy chin on Elias's knee. The dog's eyes were wide. He could sense the danger closing in. "They're coming for us, Barnaby," Elias said quietly. The ranch felt smaller now. The darkness outside felt like a solid wall. Elias stood up and checked the locks on every door. He moved with the precision of a man preparing for a siege. He did not turn on the lights. He did not want to give them a target. He sat on the floor with his back against the wall. He kept his binoculars and his monitor close. Barnaby lay down beside him. The dog did not sleep. He kept his head up. His nose was working the air coming through the cracks in the door. The Titan Corporation had sent their goons. They had cut the lines. They thought they were trapping a weak old man. But Elias was not just a man. He was a scout. And a scout is never truly alone when he has a partner like Barnaby. The shadows in the room grew longer. The wind outside began to howl through the eaves of the house. Elias closed his eyes for a moment. He visualized the map of the ranch. He planned his exits. He planned his defense. The mission was no longer just about water. It was about survival. He reached out and felt the rough collar of his dog. They would wait for the dawn, and they would be ready for whatever came out of the dark. The war had finally reached his doorstep. Elias took a slow, deep breath. He let it out slowly. The hunt had begun. Chapter 4. The Turning Point at Silver Marsh. The sky over Montana turned a bruised and sickly shade of purple. A massive storm was rolling in from the north. It was not like the gentle summer rains Elias had seen before. This was a wall of water and wind. It carried the scent of wet stone and something metallic. Elias stood by the window of the ranch. He watched the trees bend until they nearly snapped. The rain did not fall in drops. It fell in sheets. Suddenly, the land outside seemed to change. The heavy downpour was washing through the abandoned silver mine. It was flushing out years of hidden filth. Elias could see a dark and oily stream of water rushing down the hillsides. It was flowing toward the grazing lands. It was heading straight for the silver marsh. Barnaby stood at the door. He was not cowering from the thunder. His head was held high. His nostrils were flaring with an intensity Elias had never seen. The dog let out a sharp and urgent series of sounds. It was not a casual alert. It was a cry of desperation. Without warning, Barnaby pushed against the screen door with his heavy shoulder. He bolted into the swirling rain. Elias grabbed his rain gear and a medical kit. He did not hesitate. He knew Barnaby never ran without a reason. The wind tried to push Elias back. The mud was thick and slippery like wet clay. He could barely see 5 feet in front of him. He followed the sound of Barnaby's voice. It was a mournful howl that echoed through the valley. It guided Elias toward the edge of the marsh. The water in the marsh was no longer clear. It was covered in a thick and iridescent film. A sickening chemical odor hung in the air. It was even stronger than the smell of the rain. Elias found Barnaby standing near a cluster of willow trees. The dog was half submerged in the murky water. He was nudging a small and motionless shape. Elias rushed forward. His heart stopped when he saw who it was. It was a young boy. He was perhaps 10 years old. He was the son of the town's mayor. The boy was lying face down in the shallow mud at the edge of the water. The child's skin was a pale and waxy gray. His breathing was shallow and ragged. He had been out here looking for a lost calf, but he had been overcome by the toxic fumes rising from the marsh. Elias knelt in the toxic muck. He did not think about his own safety. He relied on the combat medic training he had received decades ago. He checked the boy's pulse. It was faint. It was like the fluttering of a moth's wing. Elias cleared the boy's airway. He used a clean cloth from his kit to wipe the chemical film from the child's lips. He leaned down and whispered encouragement. He spoke in the same steady voice he had used on wounded soldiers in the desert. The storm continued to rage around them. Lightning illuminated the valley in terrifying flashes. Elias lifted the boy into his arms. The child felt as light as a bundle of dry wood. Barnaby stayed close. The dog pressed his body against Elias's leg to help him maintain his balance in the surging water. They began the long and treacherous walk toward the town. Every step was a battle. The mud tried to pull the boots off Elias's feet. The wind tried to knock them over, but Elias did not stop. He was a Marine. He was a scout. He was a savior. He reached the outskirts of the town just as the local emergency sirens began to wail. People were running from their homes. They were looking at the flooded streets in panic. Elias walked into the center of the town square. He was drenched in mud and toxic runoff. He was carrying the mayor's son like a precious cargo. The mayor ran toward him. He was a man who had previously looked at Elias with suspicion and contempt. Now his face was filled with pure and raw terror. Elias handed the boy to the medical team. He stayed until he saw the child's chest begin to rise and fall more steadily. He did not ask for thanks. He simply stood there with Barnaby by his side. Both of them were covered in the evidence of the corporation's crime. The icy wall of distrust began to melt. It happened in the silence after the boy was taken to the hospital. The townspeople looked at the dark and oily water on Elias's clothes. They smelled the chemical stench. They looked at the honest and weary eyes of the old bloodhound. One by one they began to speak. A rancher stepped forward. He told Elias about 3 of his prize cattle that had died without explanation. A mother spoke about the strange rashes her children had developed after playing near the creek. Men who had taken money from Titan Corp looked at the ground in shame. They realized that no amount of money was worth the lives of their children. Regret washed over the crowd like the rain. The fear that had kept them silent was replaced by a shared and burning anger. They realized that the crazy old veteran on the hill was the only one who had been telling the truth. Elias stood in the middle of the square. He felt the weight of their gaze. He knew this was the moment. The secret was no longer a secret. The darkness was being dragged into the light of the town's lanterns. He looked at the mayor. The man was holding his wife and weeping. He looked at Elias and gave a slow and solemn nod of gratitude. The tide had turned. Elias reached down and rested his hand on Barnaby's wet head. The dog looked up at him. His tail gave a single and weary wag. The scout had found the target. The community had found its voice. The Titan Corporation had thought they could buy the soul of Silver Ridge. They thought they could bury their sins in a marsh. They had underestimated the strength of a soldier, and they had underestimated the heart of a dog. The storm was moving on, but the fire of justice was just beginning to burn. Elias knew the battle was not over, but for the first time since he arrived in Montana, he did not feel like a stranger. He felt like he belonged. He turned and began the walk back toward his ranch. He was followed by the respectful silence of a town that had finally woken up. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Chapter 5. The Final Stand. The town hall of Silver Ridge was a sturdy building made of gray stone and heavy timber. Usually it was a place of quiet bureaucracy. But tonight the air inside was thick with tension. Every wooden bench was filled to capacity. People stood along the walls and crowded the back entrance. The scent of rain-dampened wool and nervous energy hung over the room. At the front of the hall, a long mahogany table had been set up. 3 men in expensive tailored suits sat behind it. They were the representatives from the Titan Corporation. Their faces were polished and cold. They looked like statues carved from ice. The mayor stood at the podium. His face was pale. He had spent the last few days by his son's hospital bed. He cleared his throat. The sound was thin and shaky in the large room. He announced that the meeting was called to discuss the economic future of the valley. But everyone knew the truth. They were there to discuss the survival of their children. The double doors at the back of the hall swung open. Elias walked in. He did not wear a suit. He wore his old waxed jacket and sturdy work boots. He carried a thick leather folder under his arm. Beside him, Barnaby walked with a slow and rhythmic stride. The dog's claws made a steady clicking sound against the polished floorboards. A heavy silence fell over the room, as Elias approached the front. He did not look at the crowd. He kept his eyes on the men in the suits. "I have something to contribute to this discussion," Elias said. His voice was not loud, but it had the resonance of a man who had commanded men in difficult places. He opened the folder. He laid out the photographs of the illegal pipes. He produced the glass jar of tainted water, which now looked dark and vengeful under the bright hall lights. Elias then turned on a small portable projector. He had rigged it to display onto the white wall behind the podium. The room watched in horror as the grainy video played. It showed the black pipes pumping thick, oily sludge into the groundwater. It showed the chemical film spreading across the silver marsh. The lead representative for Titan Corp stood up. He adjusted his silk tie. He smiled with a practiced artificial warmth. "What we are seeing here is a collection of hallucinations," the man said. His voice was smooth and condescending. "This man is a troubled veteran. He has a history of trauma. He is confusing old mining runoff with modern industrial processes." The man leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This is nothing more than the delusions of a lonely man and his dog. There is no proof that these images were even taken on our property. We are the backbone of this economy. We provide the jobs that feed your families. Are you really going to listen to a man who talks to shadows in an old ranch?" The words were designed to humiliate. They were designed to make the townspeople feel small and dependent. Elias stood his ground. He felt the familiar weight of Barnaby's head against his hand. He did not flinch. Just as the corporate lawyer began to speak again, another sound echoed through the hall. The heavy front doors opened a second time. A tall man in a dark trench coat walked in. He carried a slim briefcase. He moved with a sharp and legal precision. Elias felt a surge of hope. It was Miller. His old comrade from Washington had arrived. Miller did not stop until he reached the mahogany table. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a document with a gold federal seal. He slapped it down onto the table. "My name is Miller," he announced to the room. "I am a federal attorney, and this is a court-ordered federal inspection and cease and desist mandate." The room erupted into a low murmur of shock. The faces of the Titan Corp representatives suddenly lost their polished glow. "We have received the evidence sent by Mr. Elias," Miller continued. "The samples have been tested. The soil is contaminated. The water is toxic. And the military dog tag found on the site belongs to a missing person whose case has just been reopened." Miller looked at the corporate men. "Your authority in this valley is over. Effective immediately, all operations are to be halted, pending a full federal investigation into criminal environmental negligence and reckless endangerment." The lead representative tried to speak. He tried to use his complex legal jargon, but the room was no longer listening to him. A man stood up from the front row. It was the rancher whose cattle had died. "I saw that sludge with my own eyes," the rancher shouted. His voice was raw with anger. "You told me it was a virus. You lied to me while my herd suffered." Then the mayor stood up. He walked away from the podium and stood beside Elias. "You almost cost me my son," the mayor said. He looked at the corporate men with a cold and quiet fury. "I took your money because I thought it would help this town. I was wrong. I will be the first to testify against you." One by one, the townspeople stood up. A mother spoke of her children's illnesses. A shopkeeper spoke of the strange smells in the air. The fear that had kept them silent for years had finally vanished. It was replaced by a powerful and united dignity. Elias stood back and watched. He saw the relief on the faces of his neighbors. He saw the way they looked at each other with renewed strength. They had reclaimed their valley. They had reclaimed their future. The men from Titan Corp gathered their papers in a frantic hurry. They moved toward the side exit, escorted by federal agents who had been waiting outside. They looked small now. They looked like thieves caught in the light of a lantern. Elias felt a strange sense of peace. He looked at the leather diary still tucked in his folder. He thought of Silas. He thought of the man who had died trying to protect this beauty. Silas could finally rest. His message had been heard. His mission had been completed by a man he had never met, and a dog that could see through the dark. The town hall began to empty. People stopped to shake Elias's hand. They reached down to pat Barnaby's head. Some were crying. Others were simply silent in their gratitude. Elias walked out onto the stone steps of the hall. The night air was cool and clean. The smell of the chemical runoff seemed to have vanished, replaced by the scent of pine and fresh earth. Miller walked up to him. He placed a hand on Elias's shoulder. "You did it, Scout," Miller said. "You held the line?" Elias looked at the mountains. They looked solid and eternal under the moonlight. "We held it together," Elias replied. He looked down at Barnaby. The dog let out a deep and contented sigh. He leaned his weight against Elias's leg. The war in the valley was not completely over. There would be trials and cleanups. There would be hard work ahead. But the enemy had been exposed. The truth had won. Elias realized that his own scars were no longer throbbing. The ghosts of the desert felt further away than ever before. He had found a new perimeter to guard, and he had found a community that was worth the fight. He took a slow and deep breath. The air felt sweet. "Let's go home, Barnaby," Elias whispered. They walked toward the truck. The sound of their footsteps was a steady and confident beat. The guardian of Silver Ridge had done his duty, and for the first time in a very long time, the soldier felt he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Chapter 6. The Soldier's Home. The morning light at Silver Ridge had changed. It was no longer a harsh glare that revealed the dust of a dying ranch. It was a soft and golden glow that danced across the rolling hills of Montana. The air felt lighter. The bitter and metallic scent that had once haunted the wind was gone. It was replaced by the honest smell of damp earth and blooming clover. The Titan Corporation was no more. Their towers of glass and steel in the city had crumbled under the weight of federal law. They had been forced to declare bankruptcy. Every cent of their remaining fortune was seized to fund the restoration of the valley. Elias stood on the edge of his property. He watched a team of environmental specialists working near the old silver mine. They were removing the last of the black pipes. They were treating the soil with care. The land was being washed clean of its poison. A few months had passed since the night at the town hall. Elias was no longer the lonely ghost in the hills. He had received a significant settlement for his role as a whistleblower. But he did not want a life of luxury. He had spent his life in service. He did not know how to exist without a mission. He looked down at Barnaby. The old bloodhound was sitting patiently by his side. Barnaby's fur was graying around the muzzle. His movements were slower now, but his amber eyes were full of a quiet and profound contentment. Elias had made a decision. With the help of the mayor and the local community, he had transformed the Silver Ridge Ranch. He called it the K9 Healing Center. The old barn had been renovated into a warm and welcoming dormitory. The fence lines were rebuilt with sturdy timber. But this was not a place for war. It was a place for healing. Elias walked back toward the main house. He saw 3 men sitting on the porch. They were younger than Elias. They were veterans who had returned from distant conflicts with shadows in their eyes. They were men who struggled to sleep. They were men who felt like strangers in their own homes. Each man had a dog by his side. These were rescue dogs from the city shelters. Many had been abandoned or mistreated. They were broken spirits looking for a reason to trust again, just like the men who held their leashes. Barnaby walked toward the new recruits. He did not bark. He did not rush. He moved with the calm and steady grace of a veteran sergeant. He went from dog to dog. He gave them a slow and gentle sniff. He offered a soft wag of his tail. Barnaby was teaching them. He was showing the younger dogs that this was a safe perimeter. He was showing them that the man on the other end of the leash was their new mission. Elias watched a young Marine named Sarah. She was sitting under the old oak tree with a jittery shepherd mix. Sarah's hands were trembling. The dog was whining and pacing in circles. Elias walked over and sat on the grass a few feet away. Barnaby followed and lay down between them. "He's not nervous about the wind, Sarah," Elias said softly. "He mirrors your heart. If you breathe deep, he will too." Elias showed her how to ground herself. He taught her the same techniques that Barnaby had taught him on those dark nights in the farmhouse. He watched as Sarah's breathing slowed. He watched as the dog finally collapsed beside her and rested its head on her lap. Sarah looked at Elias. For the first time, the tension in her jaw relaxed. A small and genuine smile touched her face. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered. Elias nodded. He felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. This was the true restoration. The water in the valley was becoming pure again, and the souls of his brothers and sisters in arms were being mended. The townspeople of Silver Ridge were frequent visitors now. The rancher whose cattle had died brought over bags of high-quality grain. The mayor's son, fully recovered and healthy, often came to play with the dogs. The community was no longer divided by secrets. They were bound together by a shared history and a common hope. The nightmares that had once plagued Elias had faded into distant memories. He no longer woke up gasping for air in the middle of the night. When he closed his eyes, he did not see the desert. He saw the green Montana hills. He saw the faces of the people he had helped. He had found his purpose. He was the scout who had stayed behind to guide the others home. The seasons continued to turn. The first snow of the year began to fall. It was a soft and silent powder that covered the ranch in a blanket of white. Elias sat in his favorite wooden chair on the porch. He wore his heavy wool coat. A mug of hot cider sat on the small table beside him. Barnaby lay at his feet. The dog's breath was a soft and rhythmic puff of steam in the cold air. Barnaby was tired. His long ears were heavy. He leaned his weight against Elias's boots. Elias reached down and stroked the dog's velvet ears. "You did good, Barnaby," Elias whispered. "You found the trail. You saved us all." Barnaby let out a long and contented sigh. He didn't need to speak. The bond between them was a bridge that required no words. Elias looked up at the night sky. The clouds had cleared. The stars were shimmering over the Montana peaks like a million diamonds. They looked so close that he felt he could reach out and touch them. He thought of Silas. He thought of the diary. He thought of the young soldier whose dog tag was now returned to his family. The valley was at peace. The mission was complete. Elias closed his eyes and listened to the silence. It was a beautiful silence. It was the sound of a heart that was finally at rest. He was no longer a soldier in a foreign land. He was a guardian in his own home. Beside him, Barnaby drifted into a deep and peaceful sleep. His tail gave one last faint thump against the wood. They were at Silver Ridge, and their souls were finally free. True loyalty is a silent promise that never fades with time or distance. Through the eyes of Barnaby and the courage of Elias, we learn that even the most broken souls can find a new path when they choose to protect the land and the ones they love. If this journey touched your heart, please join our community by subscribing and sharing your own thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us tell more stories of these noble guardians who walk beside us. Now, as the stars settle over Silver Ridge, please click on the video appearing on your screen to discover our newest story and continue the adventure with us.